Hi there, Mother Jamie here with a Good Friday message. What's the worst that can happen? That's a question that many risk takers say in jest before doing something they probably shouldn't do. Hey, what's the worst that could happen? But it's also a question many of us have been pondering on a much more serious level as we wait and watch and see what the fallout of the pandemic will be and what life will look like for us, both in terms of health and in terms of the economy moving forward. Well, on Good Friday, the most somber day of the church year, we get to experience the answer to that question. What's the worst that can happen? For the disciples who gave up everything, they walked away from their families, their jobs, their livelihoods as fishermen, tax collectors, other means of generating income for their family to follow this guy Jesus and walk around with him for 3 years. And now look what's happened. He's been arrested, executed. What's going to happen? What's going to happen to them? Everything that they had pinned their hopes on is seemingly lost. And so now they couldn't handle it. They couldn't handle the pressure. And so in terror, they're now hiding. That's the worst that could happen for them as they face an unknown future that seems to be the result of desperate and total failure. And then consider Mary. This was the young girl that we celebrated in the Feast of the Annunciation on March 25th, who said yes to God at great risk to her livelihood. She had that pregnancy out of wedlock. Joseph stood by her, and now her baby boy is suffering and dying as she watches in helpless agony. Any work of art of the Pietà conveys what she went through in such an expressive way. For a parent, watching your child suffer and die and being helpless to do anything about it is the worst that can happen. And for Jesus who was without sin, Jesus who was faithful to the end, Jesus who begged God, take this cup from me. But God could not, because to do so would have meant Jesus had to compromise his love with self-serving actions of self-preservation. And so Jesus has had to endure excruciating physical pain and torture. Crucifixion was a brutal form of execution invented by the Romans, so heinous that it was reserved only for slaves and non-Roman citizens. So if you were a Roman, you were exempt from this particular form of capital punishment. And Jesus had to endure that physical agony. And in addition to that, what was possibly equally painful was that he felt abandoned by God. He felt utterly and totally alone. Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? So lest we think that Jesus had some kind of superpowers to endure pain, unlike the rest of us, that is not true. He entered fully into the human condition and suffered as one of us. So it's all there. Anything you can devise for a worst case scenario, you can find it in the Passion narrative. And yet, even today, the darkest, most solemn day of the church year, even today, we are given the gift of foreshadowing, glimpses of the promises of the resurrection to come. Remember, what's the worst that can happen? We can console ourselves with the thought that the worst has already happened, which is why the Apostle Paul is able to go on to say so eloquently in the 8th chapter of Romans, here's why nothing, not even death, can separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus. Why we know death has been conquered, because we know the worst that can happen, and we know it is not the end of the story. Secondly, when Jesus says to his mother, as he is on the cross, "Woman, here is your son." And he says to the beloved disciple, "Here is your mother." And we are told that he took her into her own home from that point forward. It's important to know that in the Greek, home here is not meant to describe a literal dwelling, a physical house, but rather, hearkening back to the 10th chapter of John's Gospel, it means indwelling, that mutual indwelling that Jesus describes when he says, "I am in the Father, and the Father is in me." Mary is in the beloved disciple, and the beloved disciple is in her. There is a new community, a new reciprocal relationship, a new intimacy based on and through this love of Jesus. And those of us who are part of a community of faith know what it is to experience that sense of family with our brothers and sisters in Christ. It is the mutual indwelling, the abiding one with another, that intimate connectedness, that even if we're reduced to Zoom and Skype and phone calls and emails and texts, we can still experience when we are apart from one another, because we are united through the bonds of love in Christ Jesus. And third, and perhaps an image that will be all the more important as we are in our own homes these days, gazing out of the window or taking walks outside. Unique to John's Gospel is the Passion narrative is bookended with a reference to a garden. The 18th chapter of John's Gospel begins that he went out with his disciples across the Kidron Valley to a place where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. Now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, because Jesus often met there with his disciples. So like our churches that we're missing right now, the garden was a place where Jesus met with his disciples, met with his friends. It was a beautiful place of communion, of community. And then at the end of the Passion narrative, at the end of the 19th chapter, now there was a garden in the place where he was crucified, and the garden there was a new tomb which no one had ever been laid. And so, because it was the Jewish day of preparation and the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there. So Jesus is laid in a garden. And so, again, there is that sense of coming back, that sense of the cycle coming back, that sense of death leading to new life, the return to the place of beauty and communion. So as we enjoy the greening of spring around us and take walks outside and see the colors and the grass and the blossoms and feel the warm sunshine and the spring breeze, we're reminded of the passion of Jesus Christ, beginning in that place of beauty and communion and ending with his body returning to that place, a hint of things to come, a foreshadowing of the new life blooming where before there was death. And also, in the bigger picture of things, we can also think back to the Garden of Eden and the original creation of God, proclaiming that creation is good. And so we see that redemptive work, and we see that this day, where the worst that can happen happens, that it is a step towards a new life. And because of that, we spend this day in solemnity, in prayer, in grief, but not without hope, and not without a reassurance of the promises that are to come. We spend time sitting with the suffering today because it is part of what unites us in Christ. It is part of the story of God's work with the world, and we are participants in that story. So we sit with it. We don't shy away from it. We don't hide from it. But we experiencing it, knowing that the worst that can happen has already happened and will never, ever be the end of the story. I encourage you on this Good Friday to spend some time in solitude, reading slowly to yourself the 18th and 19th chapters of John's Gospel, and allow the story of Jesus's crucifixion to be your story, to enable you to recommit like Peter did after denying his discipleship, but then went on to become the rock upon which the church was built. Allow this to be a day to recommit as a disciple of Jesus Christ and to make your story this story.